My name is Sarah. I'm 24 and I live with my roommate Emma in an apartment in the suburbs of Atlanta. We're both very safety conscious, which is why we've decked out our place with a Ring peephole camera and a digital lock on our door. We thought that we were being smart, proactive really. But none of that prepared us for our neighbor, David. About 3 months ago, the sweet little family across the hall moved out and David moved in. The first time we saw him, we couldn't believe our eyes. He was hauling in boxes upon boxes of anime figurines, Star Wars posters, lightsabers, the works. Emma and I are both very nerdy people ourselves, so a few days after the moving trucks left, we decided to be good neighbors. We put together a welcome to the neighborhood gift basket, some homemade Red Dead Redemption 2 cookies, seasonal candles, and stuff like that. We knocked on his door, smiled, and handed it over. But he just mumbled an awkward thank you and barely made any eye contact, and that was that. We were kind of disappointed, but not everyone is an extrovert, right? And we figured it'd be kind of nice to have a quiet neighbor for once, even if it was a little antisocial. But it didn't take long for things to get weird. At first, it was innocent enough. Annoying, but innocent. David started popping out of his apartment every time he'd heard one of us in the hallway, like he'd been waiting by the door. He'd ask us how we were, or if we had any spare sugar or toilet paper or a screwdriver he could borrow. You name it, he'd think it up and ask for it. Sometimes he'd knock on our door and ask if we watch his apartment for an hour while he ran errands, as in he wanted us to hang out in his apartment until we came back. And we just politely say no, but it didn't seem to register. He'd just nod and shuffle back to his place, only to ask again a few days later. Emma started joking that he was our third roommate, but I could tell that she was pretty creeped out too. Then about a month after he moved in, everything just went off the rails. It was a Saturday night, and we'd been out late partying near the Braves Stadium, and we stumbled home at around 3 a.m., a little drunk but otherwise in control of ourselves, only to freeze when we hit the landing between our apartment and David's. And there he was, sitting cross-legged on the landing like some kind of yogi. As soon as he saw us, his face lit up, and then he stood up before awkwardly asking where we'd been. When we told him, he said that he'd been worried sick and how in the future we needed to tell him if we were going out for the night. We were too stunned to process it at first, and then Emma almost burst out laughing, but despite managing to stifle it, David realized that she was laughing at him. His cheeks went red, and we brushed past him into our apartment. But the next morning, when we checked the Ring footage, neither of us were laughing anymore. After we'd gone inside, David hadn't left. He'd sat back down in the hallway facing our door and stayed there for hours. The timestamp showed him sitting there, either staring at our apartment door or rocking back and forth staring at the floor until nearly 6 in the morning. It was like that scene from Paranormal Activity where he's speeding up the footage but the person is barely moving. It was creepy as hell. We called the cops, but they were useless. They only said that we could contact them if he made a direct threat or tried to get into our apartment. But since it's a shared space, they couldn't do anything about him lurking on the landing outside of our door. We're pretty sure the complex said something to him, though. We logged a complaint with them too, because for the first 5 days, there was radio silence. No knocks, no creepy hallway chats. All his creepy behavior stopped for a while. We started to relax, thinking maybe he'd gotten the hint. But we were so wrong about that. A few weeks after his little ceasefire, right when we figured it was all over, he'd lost it completely. He was out there all the time, sitting outside our door, pacing the hallway, watching us and mumbling creepy stuff under his breath. Emma started leaving for work an hour early just to avoid him, sneaking out like she's escaping a prison. I worked from home, so I was basically trapped. Every time I cracked the door to grab a package or take out the trash, there he was, waiting. He'd yell something like, "Hey, you look nice today," or "Why don't you come hang out with me?" Just innocent-sounding stuff if you were just listening in, but there was an implication. And then, whenever no one was within earshot, he'd say stuff like this one time when he told me in so many words, "If you don't come over to my apartment, I'll kill you both while you sleep. Nice and quiet, no one will hear a thing." I was so goddamned angry, but I was so stunned by the sudden upgrade to his threats that I didn't know what to say in reply. I just speed-walked back into our apartment, shut the door and locked it, and then cried until Emma got home from work. It was a total nightmare for the longest time. He started leaving notes, handwritten love letters taped on our door or slipped under the bottom, even stuck to our cars in the parking lot sometimes. They were totally unhinged too. One said, "I want you both to be my wives," and the idea of Emma being my sister wife would have been funny if it wasn't such a tangible and terrifying threat. And another one got graphic, stuff I can't even repeat here, these fantasies that made me want to gag. We noticed that he put up his own Ring doorbell after a while, angled so it was clearly watching our door. Every time we'd leave and come back, there was a new note waiting, and we realized that he'd only installed the cameras so he could figure out when we were gone. "Missed you today," one note said, but the worst was, "You're so beautiful when you sleep." Our bedroom windows faced the back of the building, and we were on the 3rd floor. We figured no way he could see in, but then one night, I woke up at 2 a.m. to a faint scratching sound. I crept to the window, scared out of my mind, and peeked through the blinds, and I swear I saw a shadow move, like some dark figure on the edges of the streetlight below. And I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but I was so scared that I barely slept that night. We called the police again about David's threats, but since the only thing we had in writing were his quote-unquote nice notes, they said their hands were tied. The best they could do was advise us to get a restraining order, like that's some magic fix that you can get overnight. Even if we did, how long would that take, and what was he going to do in the meantime? In the end, we broke our lease to just get the hell out of there and secure our own safety. It cost us a ton of money, and that hurt in its own way, but after literally one night apiece in this Airbnb we rented as like an interim apartment, it started to feel like a loss worth swallowing. We got a new place together in some place the neighbors weren't psychos, and lived happily ever after until Emma moved out to go live with her boyfriend, now husband. We're still good friends, but we've never forgotten living next to David, and I don't think we ever will. When I was in 5th grade, this new family moved into the trailer near our house. My grandpa owned it and rented it out to them, and seeing as they had 2 kids that were roughly mine and my brother's age, we were both really excited to meet them. There was Jessica, who was my age, and her little brother Jack, who was 9, same as my brother, and they seemed okay at first. Jessica was friendly and we got along fine. Jack was a different story altogether though, but I'll get to that later. Their dad was a very strange guy. He'd buy old furniture, chairs, tables, whatever he could get his hands on, and then he'd stack it up with trash in his backyard and just set it all on fire. And it happened so often that I stopped noticing the smell of smoke, and when they finally moved out, they left behind a pile of charred junk, blackened wood, and just twisted metal frames. And their trailer was a mess too, with oil stains smeared across the floors and walls. One time I went inside to find Jessica. Her dad was there, shirtless, sitting in a stained chair with a beer in his hand, and he just looks up at me and his eyes are hard and cold, and I froze. I didn't say anything, I just turned around, walked out, and never went back. And before things went bad, the 4 of us, me, Jessica, Jack, and my brother, used to ride our bikes together. Jessica was nice and easy to talk to, and we'd race down the dirt path behind the trailer, kicking up dust and laughing when one of us almost wiped out. Jack tagged along, but like I said, he was a totally different story to his sister. He'd show up to our house half-dressed, no shirt, sometimes no shoes, and snot was always smeared across his face, and he'd wipe it with his arm like it didn't bother him. My mom caught him peeing in her flower bed more than once, and she'd yell at him, but he'd just sort of grin and run off. And one time he grabbed the tassels on my bike and yanked them as I was riding, which almost caused me to fall off. I was mad, but we just kept letting him hang around. He was Jessica's brother and she was our friend, but then there was the time with the bow and arrow. I didn't even know Jack had it until he showed up at our house carrying it. It wasn't a toy, and it certainly didn't look like one either. His dad hunted deer with it for real, and I guess he'd been showing Jack how to use it, which is how he'd found out where it was kept. We were in the yard messing around when Jack pulled the string back and aimed it right at my brother's head. The arrow was knocked, the tip sharp enough to kill. My little brother didn't move. He just stood there, with his eyes wide. I screamed at Jack to stop, and he laughed like it was some game. He didn't shoot, but he didn't lower it right away either. My mom came running out and saw what was happening and just lost it. She grabbed my brother and me and dragged us inside and then told us that we weren't allowed to play with them anymore. Jessica and Jack kept coming over after that, knocking on the door, calling out our names, and we'd just sit inside and stay quiet, waiting for them to leave. Jessica would ask why we weren't coming out, and her voice just sounded very small and confused, and Jack would bang harder, just yelling out nonsense. It made us both cry, and it went on for weeks until they finally stopped. Years later, Jack and Jessica popped into my head randomly. The trailer was gone by then. Grandpa had hauled it off after the mess they left. But I couldn't shake the memory of that pile of burnt furniture, their dad's blank stare, and the look in Jack's eyes when he aimed that drawn-back bow at my little brother. I wondered what it was like for Jessica and Jack living in that place. Their parents just didn't seem to care much. Jack was wild for sure, but maybe he didn't have a chance to be anything else. No one was wiping his nose or telling him not to pee in flowers. And Jessica was different, but she was stuck there too. And while reminiscing, I remember how one night I woke up to a sound outside my window. It was late. The house was dark, and still as I pulled back the curtain on my bedroom window, I saw someone moving near the trees, someone too small to be an adult. I squinted and I thought I saw Jack's messy hair and his skinny frame. He was just standing there staring at the house, and then I blinked and he was gone. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe I'd imagined it, but I locked my windows that night, and it took me a long time before I finally got back to sleep. And looking back on everything, I feel bad for them. Jessica was a good friend, and Jack, while seeming like a total psycho, was clearly just a messed up kid without good parents. Their dad scared me, and I don't even really remember seeing the mom around. I don't know where they went after they left, but back then, all I knew was the fear of that arrow, and the sound of their knocks fading away, and the uneasy quiet that settled over our house when they were finally gone. I grew up in small-town Illinois, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. My sister and I were similar in age. She was 5, I was 7, and we used to play outside together a lot. We lived in a quiet street, so Mom didn't mind us playing in the yard or wandering a little further, so long as we stayed close enough to hear her call us in. Now looking back, I feel like the early 70s were a simpler time. At least to us they were. A time when kids roamed free and nobody thought much of it. Across the street lived a man named Mr. Wroblewski. He was older, maybe in his 50s or 60s, with graying hair and those real thick glasses, the kind that seemed to magnify a person's eyes. He didn't talk much, but he'd wave if we saw him in his yard, messing with his garden or sitting on his porch. And to me and my sister, he was just the guy across the street. Nothing about him stood out as strange, and we didn't have any reason to think otherwise. One summer, Mr. Wroblewski and my mom got to talking, and he offered to take us off her hands for an hour to go get ice creams. The parlor wasn't far. It was just a few blocks over to a little place with a red and white awning where they sold soft serve in cones and little cups with sprinkles. My sister and I loved those parlor trips, and so did our mom. I'm a father myself these days, so I know how great it can be to have even so much as an hour to just relax and recharge. It happened maybe once a week, sometimes more. He'd walk us there, buy us each a cone, and we'd sit on the bench outside the shop, eating while he kept an eye on us. Then, once we were done, he'd walk us back home. He never said much during those trips. He didn't ask us questions or try to get us to talk. He'd just sit there looking around while we ate. I don't recall feeling scared or uncomfortable, and to me it was free ice cream from the nice old man from across the street, and my sister felt the same way. We were kids, and kids don't think too hard about stuff like that. Then one day, Mom told us that we were moving. I remember it happening very suddenly. Mom told us that we were moving to a fun new place, kind of, hyping the whole thing up for us. And then we packed up our things, loaded them into a truck, and just left. I remember the new place was an apartment in a bigger town about an hour away. It had beige carpet and a balcony that we weren't allowed on for obvious reasons, or obvious if you're a parent, I guess. It was a nice apartment, and I didn't understand why we left. Mom didn't explain it. She just said that we were starting over and that was that. But even being 7 years old, I remember wondering why we'd move from a nice house in the suburbs to an apartment in the city. I missed our old house, the yard, the quiet streets, and my sister did too. But we were more concerned about our new schools than the exact reasons for that move. And we ended up moving a second time, and I think maybe a year later, and that time it was back to a rented house in the suburbs. Years went by, and I was in my junior year of high school when Mom finally told us the truth about why we had moved away from where Mr. Wroblewski used to take us for ice cream. What's crazy is that it was just a regular day, too. We were sitting in the living room, me, my sister, and my mom, when she brought it up out of nowhere. She turned the volume down on the television and asked if we remembered Mr. Wroblewski, the older guy who used to take us for ice cream. Then, when my sister and I said yes, she told us that he was a registered SO. As you can probably guess what the SO means and what it means to be registered for that, my sister and I were horrified. But we also wanted to know absolutely everything Mom had to tell us, including why the hell she had let us go get ice cream with him in the first place. And that's when she got emotional. Because at the time she had no idea that this guy was some freak. You see, back then there was no national database for people like that, and the only state that had one was California. This was also before the cops are duty-bound to inform people that their neighbors are offenders, and way before you could bring this stuff up online and see a whole map of them wherever you are in America. Mom only found out the guy was this after someone in town came over to our house to let us know. Mr. Wroblewski had been smart about those ice cream parlor trips. He always gave us the money and then told us to run ahead and grab our ice cream while he went to the general store across the street. That way, no one saw him directly interacting with us kids. It took a while before people realized what was happening. I don't know how either, but when they did, the town basically sent someone over to the house to warn Mom that we were in danger. She said she freaked out, not just for the obvious reasons either. The lady who came over told her, very boldly too, that the townspeople were planning on murdering Mr. Wroblewski. They just had to come up with a way of doing it that wouldn't attract attention of the police. And the way Mom tells it, the lady basically said something like, "Hey, your kids might have been touched by that guy across the street, but don't worry. We're gonna kill him and make it look like an accident. Have a good day." And that's why it all happened so fast, why she didn't tell us anything. She was scared, not just for our own physical well-being, but for our mental well-being too. She didn't want us anywhere near that guy, and she didn't want us to be anywhere near the house if the townspeople finally dragged him out of his home and lynched him. She said that she asked a couple of probing questions in the weeks afterwards, stuff about him and what he did while walking to and from the ice cream parlor. But since nothing had ever happened to us, none of our answers raised any red flags, and to be honest, neither me or my sister even remembered those kinds of questions being asked. We were that innocent to the whole thing. Hearing it years later hit me hard. I went quiet, my sister went quiet too, and we hadn't seen it coming. To us, he was just the ice cream guy. I don't think he ever did anything to us, and in fact, I'm 99.9% sure that he didn't. I've gone it over in my head 100 times since Mom told us, and not counting any suppressed memories that I'm not even aware of. I have zero memory of Mr. Wroblewski ever, and it makes me shudder just writing this, trying to make a move on us. Those trips to the parlor, the walks there and back, sitting on that bench, nothing stands out as wrong, and my sister says the same thing. She doesn't remember anything weird, but she remembers how distant he was. We were lucky, I guess, but it's horrible to think that we were completely ignorant to who he really was, not to mention the idea of what might have happened if we'd taken a couple more trips to that parlor with him. Mom never let us out of her sight much after that, and she got way stricter and way more protective, but I just figured it was because we were in a new place and a new city and all of that. And I used to wonder if there was any way we could have known, but we didn't even know what all of that was, to be honest, back then. We didn't know to be afraid of a quiet guy who bought us ice cream, and I mean, Mom didn't know either, not at first anyways. Small towns are supposed to be safe. That's what people say, right? They're places that you don't have to lock your car at night. And Mom grew up in the city, so she figured moving to a small town would mean that we were actually safe, but clearly she was wrong. She felt really guilty about it for a long time, too, and I could tell. She'd got this new look whenever the subject came up, like she should have figured it out sooner, and nothing we could say ever really made her feel any better. And a few years back, I looked up that Mr. Wroblewski online. His name was still on the registry. He'd been convicted a few years before we moved into the house across the street, and I could have looked up more details, but I realized that I really didn't want to know them. Just seeing his name on that registry was enough. According to the website, he was still alive and still in that same house. I wondered if he'd tried taking other kids for ice cream after we left. Sometime later, I looked him up again. I'm not even really sure why, but I just did. But when I did, I found his name had been taken off that registry, as according to the site, that only happens if someone provides proof that the person has died. And so I guess Mr. Wroblewski is no longer with us. And it's strange to think about now. That little shop with the red and white awning doesn't feel innocent anymore, and I can still picture it. The sticky cones, the hot pavement under my sneakers, and I can still see him sitting there watching us eat our ice creams. I don't know what he got out of taking us for ice cream. I don't even know why he picked us up either. Maybe he didn't do anything because he couldn't, or maybe he just didn't get the chance. Either way, it's a shadow over those memories. Not a big one, but it's there. My sister and I talk about it sometimes. Not often, but every few years something reminds us. And we agree that we're lucky. We didn't end up hurt, not physically, but it's still just creepy to think about. Neither of us have been back to that town since we left, and I don't know if the ice cream shop is still there, and I don't think I'd want to see it if it was. It's better left in the past along with Mr. Wroblewski and his quiet house across the street. When I was in middle school, we had these new neighbors that had moved in next door to us. I remember my mom talking like two saints had just moved in because they had two adopted kids, and that was seen as a very Christian thing to do. But almost immediately after they moved in, people started realizing how strange they were. One Saturday afternoon, the new neighbor lady came over to our house. I answered the door and she talked to our mom, but I overheard their conversation. The lady said that she wanted to apologize for the noise because her kids were always screaming and crying, and she hoped it wasn't bothering us. I remember being confused because I hadn't heard anyone screaming or crying, and neither had my mom. We'd seen their two kids outside sometimes, but they were always very quiet. My mom nodded politely and said something like, "It's no trouble," and then the lady left. We didn't think much of it at the time. It was just odd. But then a few weeks later, everything changed. I remember it was a Sunday, and my dad was home working in the garage, and I was inside probably messing around with my Atari when he came running into the house. He says something like, "Did you hear that?" But I hadn't heard a thing. He then put on his boots and told me to stay put, and then rushed out of the house. I later found out that he'd heard screaming from next door, from our new neighbor's place, and when he got there, he found the lady hysterical, yelling that she'd found her younger kid, the boy, unresponsive on the ground. My dad stayed over there until the cops showed up, and an ambulance came too, but it didn't take long for word to spread through the neighborhood that the little boy had passed away. At first, it seemed like nothing more than some horrible accident. The lady said the kid had fallen and had hit his head very hard on the concrete patio out back. But then the next day, more police showed up, not just the regular ones, but unmarked cars too. They put up yellow tape around the house and started questioning people in the surrounding homes, and suddenly, it didn't seem like such a tragic accident anymore. When someone let it slip that they didn't think the kid had fallen, rumors started flying. People thought the lady had beaten him to death and tried to make it look like an accident. I overheard my parents talking about it that night in the kitchen. Mom was shaken, saying that she couldn't believe something like that happened right across the street from us. My dad just stayed quiet, which was somehow even eerier than hearing my mom all shaken up. The police were in and out of the neighbor's house for days. They came to the news vans and reporters started knocking on the doors asking if we knew anything about the family next door. My parents told me not to talk to them, so I didn't, and instead, I listened. Bits and pieces came out through the neighborhood grapevine and the local news, and slowly but surely, it emerged that the lady murdered her adopted son. After she hit him so hard his skull cracked, she panicked and dragged him outside, and then staged it to look like he'd tripped. The autopsy proved that it wasn't an accident. The kid had bruises and scars all over him, and it's been going on for a while. Then the story got even darker when people started digging into the family's past. Turns out, they'd moved to our street because they'd been run out of their last neighborhood. Neighbors from their old place about an hour's drive away had reported them to Child Protective Services multiple times. There were stories of the kids showing up with bruises, of yelling heard through the walls, and the couple dodging questions about where the kids even came from. This was the 1980s, before the internet, before you could just Google someone's history. Back then, if you moved far away enough, you could bury your past, and that's what they'd done. Or at least they'd tried to do that. And the cops kept investigating them, and the biggest bombshell dropped during the murder charge. Those kids, the boy who died and the girl still living, weren't even legally adopted. The couple hadn't gone through an agency or court. They'd purchased them. That's the word that the news used, and it stuck with me. Purchased, like they were a car or a piece of furniture. No one knew exactly where the kids came from. Some said it was some shady deal with a desperate mother, and others said it was worse, like human trafficking. The police couldn't pin down the details because the couple wouldn't talk, but it was clear that those kids were never theirs, not in any real sense. The husband didn't get charged with the murder, but he went down for something else. Neglect or accessory, I can't remember exactly. But that lady, she got life. The trial was quick, and by the time it wrapped up, the family had been gone from the house for months. It sat empty for a while, the grass growing long with the windows all dark, and just about as close to a haunted house as it's possible to get if you ask me. Eventually, someone else moved in and life went back to normal, but I never forgot, and I don't think anyone else did either. Looking back, it's scary to think how close it all was. That house was right there, 50 feet from mine, and I'd ridden my bike past it 100 times. I'd seen those kids in the yard, how they seemed quiet but normal, and never thought twice about it. My parents didn't either, and no one did. The neighborhood was quiet, boring even, until one day, it just suddenly wasn't. And the whole thing lasted maybe 4 or 5 months from the day they moved in to the day the cops dragged them off. And it doesn't seem that long ago now that I look back on it, but it definitely left its mark on me. I was just a kid, barely a teenager, and I watched a murder investigation unfold across the street. And years later, I'd think about how easy it was for them to hide back then. There were no online records, no instant background checks. You could just pack up, move to a new town, and start over like nothing happened. And they almost got away with it too. If the lady hadn't killed that boy, if my dad hadn't heard her screaming, who knows how long they could have kept going. And just thinking about it makes me feel sick. Those kids never stood a chance. The boy didn't make it, and the girl, wherever she ended up, has to carry those memories with her, all because two people thought that they could buy children and treat them like trash. It's a terrible story, no way around it, and I really don't tell it often. Most people don't even want to hear something this terrible. But it's real. It happened. And it was my first lesson that the world wasn't as safe or simple as it looked from the bedroom window of a middle school-aged kid. When I was 8 years old, our neighbor robbed my dad at gunpoint. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late October. My dad had just gotten home from work and was unloading groceries from the car. I was inside watching TV when I heard a loud bang. At first I thought it was the screen door slamming shut, but then I heard my dad yelling. I ran to the window and saw a man pointing a gun at my dad's chest, and I could tell right away that it was our neighbor, who lived about 3 houses down the street. He took my dad's wallet and the car keys and then ran off into the woods behind our house. My dad stumbled inside, pale and shaking, and then called the police. The cops caught my neighbor later that night. They found him hiding in a shed about a mile away, still carrying the gun and my dad's stolen stuff. He'd been drinking and needed money for more booze, and that's what the police told us anyway. He went to prison for armed robbery, and for a while, things felt safer. I didn't have to see his rusted pickup truck parked down the street. I didn't hear his dog barking and nothing all night. But I didn't find any peace because the memory of that night stuck with me. I kept picturing that gun, the way it looked under the porch light, and my dad's hands shook after he raised them into the air. And 5 years later, when I was 13, that neighbor got out. And I found out because I saw that same rusted pickup truck parked in his driveway one afternoon when I got off the school bus. I remember how my stomach twisted up into knots before I ran inside and told my dad, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his paper, and then when I told him, he looked tired but not surprised. He said that neighbor had served his time and had every right to come back to his own home. And I didn't care about his rights. All I could think about was that gun and how close he'd been to pulling the trigger and taking my only surviving parent away from me. My mother passed away from a rare form of cancer when I was still a baby. The first night after that neighbor got back, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in that house made me jump, and I kept checking the locks on the windows. My dad noticed that I was on edge and tried to calm me down, and he told me that neighbor wasn't stupid enough to try anything again, not with the police keeping an eye on him. He also added that people can change, and we had to give him a chance. I nodded, but I didn't believe it. All I could picture was him with wild eyes and the way he waved that gun like he'd already made up his mind to kill my dad. And the nightmares started soon after. I'd dream about him breaking into our home, the gun in his hand, only this time my dad wasn't there to stop him. I'd wake up sweating, my heart pounding, and lie there staring at the ceiling until I saw daylight at my window. And it went on like that for weeks, and then months, and I'm pretty sure it took a heavy toll on my health. I stopped riding my bike past his house and took the long way around the block to avoid even looking at it. I hated feeling so scared at the time, and there didn't seem to be anything I could do to shake it. And that neighbor stayed in that house for 2 more years. I suggested that we move, but Dad said that we couldn't afford it. I don't know what he did all day, probably nothing since his truck barely moved. But then one spring, when I was 15, I noticed a for sale sign in his yard. A few weeks later, the truck was gone and the house sat empty, and it felt like a small miracle, like God had answered one of my many, many prayers. My dad said that he heard that guy move to another state, maybe to live with family, and I didn't care where he went as long as he was gone. The nightmares didn't stop right away, but they got less frequent, and eventually, I found that I could walk by that house without my chest tightening and my legs screaming at me to run. It's still there, down the road, and it doesn't feel like his anymore. But the thing that really bothers me is that, even though he's out of our lives, there's still a little portion of the memory that he'll forever occupy, and I find myself wanting more than anything to just forget. When I was a kid, my parents worked in movies, which meant they traveled a lot, and so sometimes I'd live with my grandma for months at a time. She was a quiet woman, always up early, and I liked those quiet mornings with her. But right after I started 4th grade, something strange started happening at our house. It started when Grandma began noticing that when she got home from work, the receiver of the corded push-button phone next to her bed was always off the base. This was one of those old 80s style phones with a coiled cord and a heavy handset, and she'd come home to find it either dangling, resting on the table, or some variation of not hanging up. She started blaming me for it, saying that I must have been using it after school, and even though I swore on my innocence, she'd say things like, "Well, who else could it have been, sweetie?" And this went on for a few weeks. She'd come home, check the phone, and mention it almost every time it was off the hook. And it drove me crazy. I had no reason to touch that phone. I didn't call anyone, and no one called me. She wasn't mad at first, she just said that it bugged her. But after it continued to happen, she started getting irritated and asking why I was telling such silly little lies. I started to wonder if I was forgetting something, maybe just absent-mindedly knocking it off without realizing it whenever I jumped up on her bed to see if her car was coming down the driveway. But at the same time, I knew I wasn't. It was heavy as hell, so I'd have heard it falling. One afternoon, I got home earlier than usual, and to understand why this baffled us so much, you kind of need to understand the layout of the house a little, so bear with me while I paint a picture for you. It was a small house, with the front door opening up directly onto the living room, and from there you could see the dining room, the kitchen doorway, and the stairs leading to the bedrooms. Up on the 2nd floor, my grandma's room was on the left, mine on the right, and there was a small bathroom at the end. The windows up there were all narrow, the kind that you crank open with screens that hadn't been replaced in years. They were too small for anyone to climb through, and even if someone ultra skinny did somehow shove themselves through in order to get in, getting out again without falling and breaking their legs would have been basically impossible. So as soon as I walked through the front door that day, I heard 2 distinct footsteps coming from my grandma's bedroom. They weren't loud, but they were clear. 2 thuds like someone shifting their weight on the hardwood floor. I dropped my school bag by the door and walked up the stairs, expecting to see my grandma under the assumption that she too had gotten to finish early that afternoon. And the hallway was short, maybe 10 feet, so it took me only maybe a few seconds to get to her room. But when I stepped inside, there was no one there. And I'll never forget that feeling of creeping anxiety that I felt when I realized that something was clearly off. I had 100% heard footsteps, there was no disputing that. But when I walked into Grandma's room, the bed was made, the curtains were still, and nothing looked out of place. Nothing except the phone. Just like usual, the receiver was off the base and lying on the floor, while the cord was pulled as far as it could go without plugging from the wall. It wasn't tangled or coiled up like it would be if it had just fallen. It looked deliberate, like it had been placed there carefully. And I stood there for a moment, staring at it, not being able to figure out how it got that way. Later, I tried to recreate it myself. I shook the bedside table, tipped the phone over, and even knocked the receiver off with my hand. Every time, it either stayed on the table or fell close to it, the cord curling up naturally, and the only way I could get it to land like I found it, stretched out flat on the floor, was to pick it up, pull the cord tight, and set it down on purpose. And even then, I had to hold it for a second to keep it from sliding back. There was no way that it happened by accident. After running my little test, I picked up the receiver and hung it back on the base. But then, the second I did, the phone rang. And I remember getting a major jump scare from how loud it was, which kind of makes me chuckle to think about today, but that's just about the only thing that does. Everything else is just weird. Now anyway, I answered the phone and it was my grandma. I guess I sounded nervous, so she asked what was wrong, and I just lied and said that I was fine. And then she explained how she'd called a few minutes earlier, right before I got home, I figured, and someone had picked up the phone. And whoever it was didn't say anything, just held the line for a little while until Grandma hung up. She'd been trying to call back ever since, but the line was busy. She thought the person who picked up her first call was me, and knowing it wasn't had that feeling of anxiety creeping back. I told her what happened, how I'd just gotten home and heard footsteps, and how it wasn't me that answered her first call. Grandma kind of paused and then said that she was coming home as quickly as she could. She told me to leave the room, told me that she was going to call the police, and then hung up. When Grandma said that she was calling 911, I felt this weird mix of relief and dread. Relief because I wasn't going to be alone in the house much longer, but dread because, well, what if I was never alone in the home? I backed out of her room, keeping my eyes on the phone like it might jump off the hook again if I turned away. The hallway felt narrower than usual, and every creak of the floor under my sneakers made me flinch. I made it downstairs and stood in the living room right by the front door so I could bolt if I needed to. The house was dead quiet now. No footsteps, no hum of the fridge, just an eerie silence like everything was holding its breath. I kept glancing up the stairs, half expecting to see a shadow move across the wall, but it was just the same dim light spilling out of Grandma's doorway. Maybe 10 minutes later, I heard sirens, and they started faint and then got louder until red and blue flashing lights were entering through the living room curtains. Grandma's car pulled into the driveway maybe only a minute after the police cruiser did, and I opened the front door before anyone could knock. 2 officers stepped out, then Grandma too, her coat still half on with a look of worry on her face, and she thanked the 2 cops, ran over to me, and then pulled me into a hug and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but my throat felt way too dry to say much. One of the cops came over and asked me to explain what had happened, so I told him about the footsteps, the phone stretched out on the floor, and Grandma's call. He listened and then told us to stay put while he and his partner checked the house. Grandma and I sat on the couch, her arm around me as the officers went upstairs. I could hear their boots on the hardwood, very deliberate and heavy, exactly like those 2 soft thuds that I'd heard earlier. The tall one called down after a minute saying it was clear, but they wanted us to come up and see if anything looked off. We climbed the stairs together, Grandma holding my hand tighter than usual, and her room looked the same as I'd left it. The phone was back on its holder, the bed still made, and the curtains were hanging fine. And the officers asked if anything was missing, but Grandma shook her head. I remember how one of the cops crouched by the phone, just sort of squinting at the cord. He asked me if I was certain that it was stretched out flat, and I nodded, and he picked up the receiver, letting it dangle. It swung a little, and then settled with the cord coiled up near the table, just like in my tests. He said, "Huh, weird," and then put it back on the stand. They checked my bedroom room next, and then the bathroom, and even cranked open one of those narrow windows to see if the screen was loose. Everything was fine. No footprints, no scratches, no sign that anyone had been there. One of the cops just shrugged and said that it might have been a prank call or someone messing with the line, but that didn't explain the footsteps or the phone being off the hook every day. They told us to lock up tight and call if anything else happened, and then they left. Grandma made us some tea for our nerves, and then we just sat at the dining room table trying to reassure ourselves. I remember how she said, maybe it's the house settling, but her voice didn't sound convinced, and I didn't buy it either. Houses don't settle in 2 quick thuds, and they don't pick up phones either. That night, I slept in her room on a pile of blankets that she spread out on the floor next to her bed. Neither of us wanted to be alone. The phone stayed quiet, but I kept waking up, staring at it in the dark, waiting for it to ring, or maybe even worse, move. But it didn't. And the next morning, Grandma decided that we'd figure out what was going on ourselves. She'd called in sick to work, and we spent the day just rigging up a little test. She had this old tape recorder from when my dad was a kid, one of those big old clunky things with a microphone, and we set it up in her room aimed directly at the phone. And the plan was pretty simple. Leave it running while we went out for a while and then see if it recorded anything. I wasn't sure to do anything useful. I mean, what we really needed was a video camera, but it felt better than just sitting around and waiting for the next weird thing to happen. We drove to the diner a few blocks away, ate pancakes neither of us finished, and came back after about an hour. The house looked the same. The front door was locked and the windows were shut, but my stomach tied itself into knots as we climbed the stairs and entered her room. Grandma then hit stop on the recorder, rewound the tape, and pressed play. At first we didn't hear anything. There was just static and the faint hum of the house. Grandma started fast-forwarding the tape and stopped it every so often. Then about 20 minutes in, after yet more silence, we each heard distinctive thuds, clear as anything, like someone was stepping across the floor. Grandma's grip tightened on my shoulder as we listened, then a few seconds later, we heard a soft click, which was almost certainly the sound of the phone lifting off the base. But after that, there was nothing. No breathing, no voices, just dead air until the tape hissed to a stop. And I remember each of us looking at the recorder and then at each other, and then Grandma said, "That's it. We're getting out of here." She didn't call the police again. She said they'd just tell us the same thing as last time, and instead, she packed up a bag for both of us and we drove to my aunt's place about an hour away. And I didn't argue. I didn't want to spend another minute in that house. A few days later, Grandma got a call from her neighbor, Mr. Haxel, who had been keeping an eye on the house. He said that he'd gone to water the plants and found the phone off the hook again, cord stretched out flat on the floor. And nothing else was touched. No broken locks, no open windows, just the phone. And Grandma thanked him, hung up, and then politely informed him his services were no longer required. I don't know what he said in response, but before she hung up, Grandma made it clear to old Mr. Haxel that he wasn't going to go into her house anymore. She didn't explain why, and I guess Mr. Haxel must have found that very confusing, maybe even kind of rude. And I asked Grandma why she didn't tell him about the phone or the thuds, and she said that she didn't want to scare him. We stayed with my aunt for the rest of that school year. Grandma sold the house a few months later, and she let some realtor handle all of it and never stepped foot in that place ever again. The new owners didn't mention anything strange, at least not that we heard. Maybe it stopped, maybe it didn't. Years later, I asked Grandma if she ever figured out what it was. She just shook her head and said that she didn't want to think about it. I don't either, but as much as I wish it could, that doesn't stop me. I don't know who was in that house with us, but I know it wasn't me knocking that receiver off. I know it wasn't Grandma either, and since I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, I can only assume it was one of her neighbors. I sometimes wonder how they got in, but those thoughts are always quickly overridden by a much more frightening idea. That one of our neighbors had unwillingly made us part of some sick fantasy that thankfully they never had the chance to realize. I lived in a basement apartment. It was small, a damp space with one window near my bed directly under the house upstairs. When I first moved in, a very nice lady who will remain nameless lived above me with her 2 kids and her boyfriend, Ryan. Now back then, things were fine. Ryan was always an angry drunk, but she acted as a buffer and kept him in check. But 2 years into me living there, she left him and took the kids, and after that, it was just me and Ryan, and it felt like I had been thrown to the wolves. Ryan had always been hostile. Early on, after my friends left, I made a mistake. I tossed an Amazon box in his recycling bin without breaking it down, but instead of a simple, "Hey, don't do that," he texted me, "You stupid effing C-word, you put this in my trash and didn't even break it down." And that wasn't the first time that he talked to me like that, it was just the loudest. A year and a half before, I told him to never speak to me again and blocked his number, and it didn't stop him. Parking there was an absolute nightmare. I'd been at that place for 3 years and only got worse. I worked nights, so I was stuck with whatever spots were left when I got home. And one night after midnight, I pulled into the driveway behind Ryan's car. I figured that he wouldn't need to leave that late, and I'd move mine by 7 a.m. so he wasn't blocked. But I was wrong. At 12:30 a.m., just as I got into bed, he starts screaming my name and pounding on the door. "C-word this, get out here, you C-word." And I dragged myself outside and moved the car. and he followed me, ranting and calling me all sorts of terrible things. He raised his hand like he was going to hit me. I stared him down and said, "Oh, we're gonna hit me now, Ryan? Gonna hit a woman, huh?" And he just sort of sneered. "You're not a woman. You're..." And he goes on to say more expletives. And I just went back inside, my heart racing. And that was when I started planning to move. October was the goal, but the area was expensive and I couldn't make it happen fast enough. And then one day, it changed everything. Ryan had a 19-year-old daughter who split time between his place and her mom's. She didn't stay there often, but her bedroom was right above mine. Her window was always open. Mine usually wasn't. Basement air was stale, but I dealt with it. That day I cracked my window for some air and I had my TV on, volume at maybe 24, and I lived there long enough to know that 30 was the limit before it bothered anyone upstairs. My friend used to text me if it got too loud, but with the windows open, yeah, Ryan's daughter probably heard it too. She'd stomped on the floor before when she thought I was loud, and I'd ignore it mostly. This time, I'd had enough of the disrespect. I stepped outside and called up to her window. "Hey, if you thought I was too loud, close your window." She exploded, saying, "Listen, it's quiet hours, you effing loser who lives in our basement." And we never even spoken before. I tried to stay calm. She was just a kid, but I yelled back that she was disrespectful, but she kept screaming at me just like her dad. And I snapped. "Oh, you just like your dad, huh?" And went inside. And the next morning at 7:30 a.m., I woke up to Ryan hammering on my door. It sounded like he was trying to break it down, screaming terrible things. You called my daughter a..." he roared. All this insane stuff, and I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and started recording, and his fists slammed the wood, the frame rattling. "Open the door," he screamed. I stayed silent, frozen, and he kept going, screaming these threats. I called the police, but they didn't do anything. They said it was a civil matter since he didn't actually hit me. He didn't stop, though. Later, as I unloaded groceries from my car, he leaned out of his window and yelled, "Yeah, keep moving, you fat effing C-word." I'm sorry to keep using that, but that seems to be a theme with the way he would talk to me. It was genuinely insane. And I decided that I'd move at the end of August, not October. I couldn't stay there. And that night after the grocery incident, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel right. My window was still cracked open, and I hadn't closed it after the fight with his daughter. At around 2 a.m., I heard something. A faint scrape, like metal on glass. I sat up, straining to listen, and it came again, sharper from the window. I crept over, peering out into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the empty backyard and the silhouette of Ryan's house looming above. And then I saw it. A glint, quick and small, like a blade catching the moonlight, and my blood turned to ice. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and backed away. Was he out there? I couldn't tell, but I didn't sleep that night. At 4 a.m., I heard footsteps upstairs, very heavy and very deliberate, pacing right above my bed. Ryan's daughter wasn't there that night. I'd seen her leave earlier, and it was just him. Morning came slow. I checked the window. Scratches marked the glass, very thin and very jagged, like someone had dragged something sharp across it. I packed faster after that, throwing clothes into bags, counting the days until August ended, but the nights got worse. One night, I could hear breathing, low, steady, and right outside the window. I didn't look, though. I couldn't. I turned the TV on, volume at 10, and just to drown it out. It stopped after an hour, but I still didn't sleep. And the next day I found a note slipped under my door. No words, just a crude drawing of a stick figure with a knife in its chest. And my hands shook as I crumpled it up. I called the police again, and they came, looked at it, and said they'd talk to him, but I could tell they really didn't care. And in the end, I made it out. By the last day of August, I loaded my final box into my car and drove away from that basement apartment, leaving Ryan and his rage behind. I found a new place, a small, quiet unit on the second floor of a building with no shared walls and no looming houses above me. The first night I slept with the window open, letting the cool air drift in, and heard nothing but the hum of distant traffic, and for the first time in years I felt that tension unwind from my shoulders. I unpacked slowly and settled in and reclaimed the peace that had been stolen from me. Ryan was gone from my life, and I was finally free. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email at LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and new big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Mr. Wroblewski voted for Trump. We gotta get out of here.